the theological unity of God across the Testaments, promise plan coherence, Hebraic cognitive environment, and the resolution of apparent moral discontinuities. Many people today treat the Bible as if it presents two different gods. They picture the God of the Old Testament as a God of raw wrath and ethical problems, and the God of the New Testament as a father of pure love and grace. This perceived split is not rooted in the text itself. It comes from later philosophical overlays, Greek analytical dualisms, and 19th century evolutionary models of religion. Drawing primarily on Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s work recovering the unity of the Bible, especially chapter 7, this essay shows that God is morally and ontologically consistent across both testaments. Using Kaiser's promise plan theology as a center drawn from the text itself, recovering ancient Near Eastern linguistic idioms, and reading Scripture within its native Hebraic cognitive environment, the apparent ethical problems dissolve. Both testaments present one Yahweh whose absolute holiness and burning love naturally express themselves as controlled, righteous indignation toward evil. This character culminates in the redemptive work of Jesus the Messiah while preserving the concrete future of ethnic Israel within the one people of God, as Paul teaches in Romans chapter 11, verses 25 through 29. The question whether the God of the Old Testament is the same as the God of the New is one of the oldest crises in biblical interpretation. In the 2nd century, Marcion claimed the Hebrew Scriptures revealed an inferior, harsh creator God, opposed to the loving Father proclaimed by Jesus. Early church fathers such as Irenaeus and Tertullian vigorously defended the organic harmony of the two testaments, yet the dualism has persisted. Modern scholarship often revived it through evolutionary models that portrayed Israelite religion progressing from primitive tribalism to enlightened Christian monotheism. The result is a caricature, Yahweh as a deity of caprice and vengeance, the New Testament God as anodyne and without judgment. Kaiser demonstrates that this division distorts the textual witness. The perception of contradiction arises from isolating ancient narratives from their literary, linguistic, historical, and covenantal contexts. The God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are the same sovereign Lord. His character of holiness, justice, mercy, and love remains consistent. When problematic passages are examined with rigorous grammatical historical exegesis inside the ancient Near Eastern cognitive environment, the alleged moral defects dissolve. To establish this unity, the interpreter must identify a unifying center that emerges from the text rather than being imposed from outside. Classical dispensationalism sometimes creates artificial discontinuities between Israel and the Church. Classical covenant theology sometimes spiritualizes or transfers concrete land and national promises given to ethnic Israel. In contrast, Kaiser proposes the promise plan of God as the Bible's own text immanent center. First announced in Eden concerning the seed of the woman in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, structurally anchored in the unconditional Abrahamic covenant in Genesis chapters 12, 15, and 17, reaffirmed at Sinai, expanded in the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7, interiorized in the New Covenant in Jeremiah chapter 31 and Ezekiel chapter 36, and climactically fulfilled in the Messiah while preserving Israel's future vocation, this single promise trajectory unfolds progressively throughout the canon. The unity produced by the promise plan is organic, not mechanical. The 66 books function as a living whole. They exhibit structural unity, historical unity, prophetical unity, doctrinal unity, spiritual unity, and charagmatic unity. Diversity of context and genre does not signal contradiction. It reflects the progressive unfolding of a single divine character from the seed promise through the covenants to the messianic consummation that grafts the nations into Israel's nourishing root without erasing Israel's irrevocable calling. The primary obstacle to recognizing this unity is the assumption that divine wrath belongs to the Old Testament and divine love to the New. Both wrath and love appear prominently in both testaments. In the early church, Lactantius argued that a God who cannot experience righteous indignation toward evil is incapable of loving goodness. Divine anger in the Hebrew Scriptures is not an uncontrolled outburst. It is divine pathos, the deliberate friction of holy love encountering stubborn rebellion. Severe divine wrath against sin is also taught throughout the New Testament. John the Baptist warned of the coming wrath. Jesus spoke more about judgment and Gehenna than any Old Testament prophet. Paul roots his gospel in the reality that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. The book of Revelation presents imagery of divine judgment that equals or exceeds any Old Testament account. Conversely, the Old Testament is saturated with grace and steadfast love. The foundational self-definition of God, cited more frequently than any other text, is Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7. Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. Jonah's grievance was precisely that Yahweh is so merciful he would forgive the Ninevites if they repented. The central motivation of God's redemptive work is agonizing covenantal love. This consistency rests on divine immutability. Malachi chapter 3 verse 6 declares, "For I, Yahweh, do not change. Therefore you, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed." James affirms there is no variation or shifting shadow with the Father of lights. Hebrews attributes the same unchangeable nature to the Messiah. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Immutability does not mean static impassivity. In the Hebraic environment, God's unchanging nature means he is utterly faithful to his character and promises. When humans change their moral posture, God dynamically adjusts his interaction precisely because his ethical standard remains unalterable. Kaiser isolates major problem areas where Old Testament narratives appear to present a God of dubious morality. Careful exegesis shows these accusations stem largely from modern misunderstandings of Semitic idioms and ancient contexts. First, the declaration, "Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated," from Malachi and quoted in Romans. In Semitic usage, the verb to hate, when paired with to love, functions as an idiomatic figure of speech denoting choice or comparative valuation, not emotional malice. Genesis 29 illustrates this. Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah, and the text says Leah was hated. Jesus used the same idiom when he said disciples must hate father and mother. The language concerns sovereign election to the promise plan trajectory. Second, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Throughout the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Only later does the text state that Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart. God's action was judicial confirmation of the choice Pharaoh had already made, handing him over to the consequences of willful rebellion, precisely mirroring Paul's framework in Romans chapter 1. The goal was that the Egyptians might know that Yahweh is God. Third, the lying spirit in 1 Kings chapter 22. Critics charge God with authoring deception. The objection fails to account for Hebraic narrative style, in which secondary causes and permissive acts are frequently attributed directly to God's sovereign agency. Ahab had already rejected Yahweh's word for years. God judicially permitted an evil spirit to fulfill Ahab's desire for delusion. Fourth, allegedly unethical commands. The command to sacrifice Isaac was explicitly a temporary test of loyalty, never intended for completion. God provided a substitute. Child sacrifice is condemned throughout the rest of the canon as an abomination that never entered God's mind. The instruction for Israel to ask for gold and silver from the Egyptians uses the verb, meaning to request a gift, not to borrow under false pretenses. The Egyptians willingly gave the valuables. This was the long overdue payout of back wages for centuries of slave labor, fulfilling the promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. Moses' initial request for a 3-day journey was a graded pedagogical test. God offered a modest, reasonable first demand. Pharaoh's total refusal of even this small concession left him without moral excuse. Fifth, the destruction of the Canaanites under the harem command. This was not ethnic hatred, but judgment on severe moral and religious depravity. Archaeological discoveries at Ugarit confirm the extreme toxicity of Canaanite religion, including child sacrifice and institutionalized sexual perversion. God waited 400 years while the iniquity of the Amorites reached full measure. Herem functioned as moral surgery to protect the promise plan trajectory for the nations. God's standard was impartial. He warned Israel that the land would vomit them out if they adopted the same practices, a threat realized in the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles. This was a unique, unrepeatable judgment on the same plane as the flood or Sodom and Gomorrah. To grasp the full unity, the reader must recover the ancient supernatural architecture inhabited by the biblical authors. The Hebraic cognitive environment understood the universe as a cosmic temple governed by Yahweh alongside a heavenly host. Scripture traces God's single promise plan as it systematically reverses three compounding cosmic rebellions: the Edenic rebellion, the transgression of the Watchers, and the disinheritance at Babel. The promise plan, initiated with Abraham immediately after Babel, is Yahweh's campaign to reclaim the disinherited nations, disarm rebellious spiritual powers, and restore unmediated divine presence. When the New Testament portrays Jesus, it does not introduce a new God. Jesus is the incarnate Word and visible manifestation of Yahweh, the same divine person who walked with Adam, appeared to Abraham, spoke to Moses, and led Israel as the angel of the Lord. His cross and resurrection represent the definitive victory in this cosmic war. Gentile believers are grafted into the nourishing root of Israel's covenant tree. Crucially, this expansion does not annul the concrete, future-oriented promises given to ethnic Israel. The gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. The claim that the God of the Old Testament is a deity of raw wrath while the God of the New Testament is a father of pure love is unsustainable. Yahweh's character is consistent and continuous. His holy wrath is the necessary protective response of a loving Creator against that which destroys human flourishing. That same holy wrath is affirmed by Jesus and the apostles. The tender mercy and steadfast love that shine in the Gospels are the exact attributes proclaimed in Exodus chapter 34 and demonstrated throughout Israel's history to the messianic climax that preserves Israel's future within the one people of God. Recovering this organic unity equips the Church to defend the moral integrity of the entire canon, liberates preachers from abandoning the Hebrew Bible, and provides a solid foundation for apologetics. By setting aside post-canonical philosophical overlays and allowing Scripture to speak through its own Hebraic logic, the Church encounters the true, living God, the unchanging Lord of history whose promise plan endures from generation to generation.